Unmuted.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We are so pleased that you could join WAND for this presentation, and we're very excited to hear from Che Johnson-Long of Georgia WAND. My name is Udzi Vokiwa. I am a Senior Program Associate at WAND, and I will be running the technology today. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. You can submit your questions for Che by typing them into the questions section of your panel on the right-hand side of your computer screen. I'll ask these questions aloud to Che after she finishes her presentation. Also, this webinar will be recorded and available to view on the WAND YouTube page after it's completed. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about Che. Che serves as the program manager for Georgia WAND, and her role is to advance Georgia WAND's critical education and mobilization efforts across the state. Che hails from Los Angeles by way of Hawaii, and she's dedicated her life to organizing around community-based strategies for ending violence. As the former program coordinator of the Safe Outside the System collective of the Audre Lorde Project based in New York City, and a current member of the Solutions Not Punishment Coalition, Che works with communities most affected by violence to develop political education and campaign strategies that increase capacity for safety and wellness. And now I will turn it over to Che for her presentation.
Hello, lovely people. Thank you for joining us.
Che?
I guess this is Hello? 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 Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. All right. Technology, y'all. Thank you for having me post-lunch. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. I'm sort of new to the land of webinars, so please excuse the technological learning curve. I really want to thank Udzi for setting this up, and especially National WAND for just allowing us the opportunity to talk with folks today. I'm really excited about figuring out national strategies for plugging people into our work here in Georgia. So like Udzi said, if y'all have questions, please feel free to write them in the comment box, and then we'll get to them at the very end. So the topic for today is environmental justice at the intersections of nuclear and race. This is an issue that has been prevalent in the United States, specifically in the Southeast, for quite some time. But it's one of those things that you don't often hear about in the news, and there's not a lot of language around. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of defining some terms for folks today, just so that we're all on the same page. So first, I just wanted to give folks a little bit of a backstory on Georgia WAND. Our mission is to educate the public and to create public opinion leaders about the need to reduce violence and militarism in society, and to redirect excessive military spending to unmet human and environmental needs. We've been around for about 35 years, and we follow a long legacy of activism for nuclear accountability in the U.S. We focus mostly on the impacts of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons at the state and regional level, And we're an independent grassroots and women-led organization that seeks to direct women's voices into powerful movement for social change. So a lot of the work that we do is with community members, it's with regular people, and really making a lot of these issues around nuclear and military spending understandable and accessible, and then working with folks to build community power. So like I said, I want to make sure that we all sort of have an understanding of what we mean when we say environmental justice. We hear a lot of these buzzwords, but sometimes we don't take the time to define them. So I'm going to start just by talking about institutional racism and environmental racism. So we define institutional racism as when an institution enacts policies that concentrate power and leadership in the hands of people in power. Now, this could be used across the board in terms of identity. We could talk about institutional and environmental sexism, which is an institution that would privilege men's participation, men's leadership. We could talk about it in terms of racism, an institution that privileges white folks over folks of color. It's sort of an interchangeable term, and it's really helpful because it helps us to get outside of the idea of simply one-on-one racism, right? Racism between two individual people, and look at it at more of a system-wide lens, which then helps us to tackle it at the legislative table. So the next thing that I wanted to define is environmental racism. So similar to institutional racism, this is when environmental contamination, hazards, toxic waste disproportionately affect folks of color and communities of color. Specifically, this can look like place-based racism, and that's another way that folks have come to define this term. Lastly, I want to define social justice. So, like I said earlier, a lot of Juan's work here in Georgia is about working with regular people to build power. And so we believe that one of the best ways to do that is to look at the root causes, right? So while talking about nuclear production and nuclear waste, we also have to talk about a culture of violence and a culture of militarism that is certainly prevalent in the South, probably throughout the entire U.S. So a lot of our work is looking at addressing the root causes of certain issues. So this is my favorite one. So another thing that I want to talk about is community power. So again, we believe that the folks who are most affected by nuclear production are the ones who should really be leading the way. And for us, this means folks who live closest to nuclear plants. So I'm going to be spending the rest of our time talking about a specific community in Georgia called Shell Bluff, which is about 3 hours east of Atlanta. This is one of the communities that is directly affected by these issues. It's also a community that experiences all kinds of other issues because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so a lot of the work that we do is around empowering folks to advocate for policy, do grassroots organizing, leadership development, collaboration, and learning work. So the problem, I hope that y'all can see my mouse here. So this first map that you see on the right-hand side, it has a river flowing through. This is just to give you a sense of where we are in Georgia for folks who are not familiar with Georgia. So this river here is what separates, this is Georgia, and then this is South Carolina over here. So Shell Bluff is right about here. You can see that. And it's wedged in between two nuclear plants, the Savannah River site, which is a weapons plant, and then Plant Vogtle, which is an energy plant. So how does environmental justice intersect with nuclear weapons production and waste and nuclear energy expansion? Well, one of the ways that it intersects is through Shell Bluff. Shell Bluff is, if you can see on the map, it's downwind from the Savannah River site. And that's both due to its location and also due to the flow of the trade winds and surface and groundwater. The Savannah River site, which is up there at the top, was built to manufacture plutonium and tritium for nuclear weapons. It operated in secrecy without any environmental regulation from about 1950 to about 1987. So that's 40 years where these 5 reactors and 2 vast reprocessing canyons, as we call them, produced about 1/3 of the nation's plutonium and all of the nation's tritium, which is radioactive hydrogen, and that gives a bomb its yield. So that's all of our tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and SRS still extracts tritium because of the nuke bombs. They need to be able to get new tritium ever so often because it has a shorter life, of the ionizing radiation. So at the end of the Cold War, the mission of SRS grew to include environmental cleanup of about 35 or so million gallons of highly radioactive liquids that are stored in 47 huge underground tanks. So over the years, these tanks, they corrode, they leak, they have cracks. 7 of them are sinking below the water table. 4 of them are completely submerged under the water table. So on the eastern outskirts of the Barnwell radioactive waste disposal site, which is also one of the things that contributes to pollution in the area and into what feeds into the Savannah River. So this is only one environmental factor that affects Shell Bluff, and you can just see from the map that the Savannah River site is right next to Shell Bluff. Also, just to give you sort of a visual, the Savannah River site is about the same size as Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, which is also about the same size as DC. So this is definitely no small feat. One of the other issues that compounds Shell Bluff is Plant Vogtle, which is on the other side of the river, on the Georgia side. So Plant Vogtle is located just across the river. Tritium is also a regular release from the nuclear power plant. As you can see from the map, this is a systemic problem. There's a ton of toxic industry upstream. We have a lot of paper mills. There's a polymer plant. That the pollution discharge regulations don't account for what's already in the water because of these plants. So the other issue that comes up because of where Shell Bluff is located is that there isn't just one entity that oversees both of these plants. They're different. Because one is a nuclear weapons plant and one is a nuclear power plant, nobody is looking at sort of the release from both of these plants together. And we know tritium that gets into the atmosphere, it doesn't matter which plant it comes from, and that compounds, and it compounds into the air, it compounds into the water, and it also compounds into people's bodies. So I want folks to just kind of keep that in mind as we go on through the rest of the presentation. Also spatially, I just want y'all to keep in mind the size of these plants in relationship to Shell Bluff. Oh, and I also wanted to note that Savannah River is the 3rd most contaminated river in the country. So as we move on, so I want to talk about Plant Vogtle a little bit more. That's the energy plant. So Plant Vogtle sucks in water from the Savannah River to cool its reactors in a closed-loop system. Plant Vogtle has regular releases of radiological effluent. About 75 million gallons per day of water is used at Plant Vogtle, and most of that water comes out of the river. About 1/3 of that water is immediately then returned to the river. However, the water is now what they call thermonuclear, meaning it's extremely hot, and therefore it's a contaminant. It's hotter than the water that it's going back into. So thermonuclear water contributes to the deoxygenation of parts of the Savannah River. About 2/3 of the water that returns back into the air from the steam. So if you can see at this picture on the left, this is the steam coming off of those towers. This steam then goes into the atmosphere, and then it comes back down through rain. But what radionuclides are being pumped out of the cooling towers? This is one of the issues that Georgia WAND is addressing, trying to figure out how this effluent can get monitored, because at this point it's not. So right now we don't actually know how contaminated the water is that's going into Plant Vogtle, because no one is monitoring this water and what's coming up through the intake valves. So I'll talk more about that in just a minute. I also want to just note that uranium is what's used to help power the plant, which adds the release of radionuclides. For some of y'all, this might be a bit of a chemistry lesson. I know that when I started at Georgia WAND, it felt like I was back in high school chemistry. So Vogtle is currently expanding to 4 reactors. Currently, there are 2 reactors. If and when the 3rd and 4th reactors go online, this would be the only plant in the entire country to have 4 operating reactors on site. This doesn't take into account that SRS is only a few miles away. So this is a huge issue for folks who live near the plant. It's a huge contaminant, and it's also a very unique issue to this area, one that is felt locally, certainly by the people who live near the plant, but also one that's felt nationally. It's sort of a precedent, if you will, that if an area like Shell Bluff can experience this level of contamination, the question then becomes who's next, and how do you choose those areas, and which communities get the brunt of that construction. So then I'm going to move over to talk about the Savannah River site. So like I said, this is the weapons plant. This area is about the size of Atlanta, a little bit bigger, I believe, and also the size of DC, just to give you a sense. I think that Shell Bluff is about, I want to say, a size, if that. So first, let's just take a step back and talk about groundwater contamination. So there's several large swaths of concentrates of contaminated groundwater plumes that sit below the surface of SRS. These are mainly found near the F area, which is down here, and the H area. These huge plumes lie at the headwaters of 2 major creeks that then feed into the Savannah River. They're very close to Shell Bluff, and mainly the upper 3 runs and 4 Mile Branch Creek. So you can look closely and see that 2 of the plumes are very close to the Savannah River, near where Plant Vogtle is also sited. Groundwater contamination has traveled underneath the Savannah River and over to Georgia, contaminated Georgia water through the Floridian aquifer. In fact, well water, which is sort of similar, has been found to have concentrates of tritium as well. So it's a groundwater issue, but then it also becomes a well water issue, which then becomes a drinking water issue. So these plumes are moving closer and closer to the river. So this is just to give you a sense of sort of the layout. So these are the creeks that will eventually flow into the river. This is the upper 3 miles run, and then down here we have the 4 Mile Branch Creek. So these large plumes from the previous slide have contaminated upper 3 runs creek up at the top and 4 Mile Branch. Where these creeks meet at the Savannah River is also filled with plumes. So the contaminated upper 3 runs area and then the 4 Mile below. One of the reasons for these plumes is that the old radioactive waste burial ground is halfway up 3 Mile Branch. Also, 4 Mile Creek sits near to a location at SRS where they're basically blowing tritium into the trees to help disperse the radioactive pollutants into the air and absorb that into the trees. Another problem is that they're currently doing military training with troops very close to the upper 3 runs. So as you can see, these plumes in the creek and the mouths are very close to the intake valves of Plant Vogtle and the new intake valves for plants for units 3 and 4, which are the ones that are under construction right now. So then the question then becomes, with all of this sort of nuclear contamination, how does this affect community members, right? How does this affect people? So I just want to give you a sense of what Shell Bluff looks like. This is a really great picture from one of our meetings and the back of one of our organizers, Bernice, with a vintage National WAN t-shirt on. So Shell Bluff is a largely Black and working class community. It's got about 22,000 people. It's in Burt County. Shell Bluff is about the 81st most populated county in the state of Georgia. And out of 159 counties, it's about 82% rural. And so it's very, very spread out. People call it a sprawl. It's also the 5th largest county in Georgia for a population density of about 27 people per mile. So Shell Bluff, like many other rural communities in Georgia and in the southeast, have a lot of Black churches. It's definitely a community where people know each other. For folks who are listening in from the Northeast, this might be a little foreign to y'all. There's a lot of saying hello. There's a lot of families who stay in the area for generations. It's also an area that has been known for agriculture. So it's one where people really pay attention to the land, and a lot of folks have made their living off of the land. Because Shell Bluff is between these two plants, and because it's a working class community, the plants provide a lot of jobs to the community, which means a couple things. One, which you can imagine, is that because a lot of people plant, there's definitely a legacy of silence around how the plant actually affects people's health. Imagine that if this is your bread and butter, it would be difficult to speak out against or even question the health concerns or the health risks, right? We know that residents of Shell Bluff have experienced increased levels of tritium, of cesium, of other radiological contaminants in the air and the water. We also know that Shell Bluff has experienced significant increased rates of cancer since the plants have been built. We know that because there's increased unemployment, there's what we call youth flight, which is really common in rural areas, especially in the southeast, where young people leave as soon as they can, and that really weighs down on sort of the socioeconomic state of the community, and therefore makes the community more dependent on the plants for jobs. It's one where there's, a lot of the farmland has become very commercialized, and also within the community, there's an understanding that people get sick, and that's sort of just the way it is, which might be different in a more urban place that's not so heavily reliant on these plants for jobs. So like I said earlier,
Uh-oh, Tay, I think we might have lost you. We'll just give it one more minute for Che to get reconnected. All right, appreciate your patience, everyone. Sorry about that. Che is calling right back in, and she'll restart her presentation in just a minute. Sorry about the interruption, everybody. Che's just getting reconnected, and she'll get started with her presentation in just a minute. All right, Che, are you back?
Sorry about that. Yeah. Sorry about that, y'all. So, as I was saying before technology intervened, so a lot of these health risks that we see in Shell Bluff, they're ones that a lot of folks don't talk about. They feel like they can't talk about. They feel like if they do talk about them, that it'll affect their ability to maintain a job. So this is a really important issue because it comes into play when we talk about trying to address these problems. So another issue in the region is environmental monitoring. So like I was saying earlier about the plumes, a lot of this is not monitored, and a lot of what comes out of the plumes, people don't actually know the levels of tritium that are in the atmosphere. So the EPD used to have an environmental monitoring project, independent radiological monitoring in Georgia around Plant Vogtle and SRS on the Savannah River site, and it's been there since about 1977. The last time that the EPD conducted independent monitoring was when they collected and analyzed data from 2000 and 2002. At that time, EPD found that Shell Bluff had elevated levels of contaminants. Tritium was definitely the worst offender. It's virtually in all of the media, the air, groundwater, surface water, rain, certainly in the produce, milk, green leafy vegetation, fish, etc. Tritium measured well over 100% of the EPA's drinking water maximum, and it was over 100%, and it was way above sort of the limits. The data also found that elevated levels of cobalt-60, iodine-129, cesium-137, plutonium-238, and plutonium-239. For example, in 4 Mile Creek, they had a lot of iodine-129, and the Savannah River had a lot of cesium-137, which is cause for concern because this affects people. This gets into their skin. This is the fish that a lot of people eat, and the green leafy vegetables that a lot of folks eat, and that gets exported into Atlanta and other parts of Georgia. So SRS also does limited monitoring in Georgia, as does Plant Vogtle. However, there have been discrepancies in the data. One example is that in 2002, the Georgia EPD data found that close to 20,000 picocuries per kilogram of tritium in both the bottom feeder of the fish at the 4 Mile Creek, which is inside of the SRS plant. Whereas the data from SRS showed that it was lower than 1,000. So this is a huge discrepancy from 20,000 to 1,000, and this is part of why it's critical that there is a truly independent environmental monitoring program so that we're able to showing, you know, what is actually in the water and how much tritium is actually getting into people's bodies. So as a women's group, one of the reasons that this is such a huge concern to us is because we know that women and children experience these levels differently than anybody else. The dosage levels are currently, that are legal, are currently based on what we call a reference man. And a reference man is a male-bodied person that's about 170 pounds, that's healthy and middle-aged. Now, we know that a lot of the folks who live in Shell Bluff are not this reference man. In fact, many of us on this call are not this reference man. They don't take into account that people have smaller bodies, smaller body mass, that those who are sick or elderly, that those who rely on the local vegetation and therefore are taking more in are going to have a different dosage level than this ideal reference man. So the tritium in water is far more dangerous for women specifically, but also for children who are smaller and for developing fetuses, of course. The radionuclide regulations don't take into account that a woman's unique metabolism, children's needs, or the ability to pass environmental toxins through the placenta to the fetus of a pregnant woman. It's potentially causing fetal anomalies and pregnancy failures. For example, because tritium is not regulated for either of these, for non-cancer effects, the federal limit for tritium contamination in drinking water is inadequately protective. I just want to talk I just want to share one more point, which is that as you can see, nuclear weapons production, maintenance, and waste, and nuclear energy generation is at its core a family issue, and specifically a rural family issue that then trickles out to the rest of us and the rest of the country. So I've talked about all these different issues that come from the plants and all the ways that Shell Bluff experiences contamination. Now I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing about it. So over here we have one of our fearless leaders. This is Annie Laura. Annie Laura lived in Shell Bluff for a very long time and is part of why there is even a culture of talking about this issue at all in the community. So there are three things that we are working on here at Georgia WAND. The first one is environmental monitoring. So throughout the entire presentation I've talked about all of these different issues and all of the ways that we know that the plumes and that the groundwater are contaminated, but there isn't a way of actually measuring them that's independent. So one of the things that we're working on is developing a community-led environmental monitoring program. One of the reasons why nuclear has been so successful in contaminating Shell Bluff is because of militarized spending and the need for women's civic engagement. A policy win in federal spending and nuclear weapons policy must be led by an engaged women's group, folks who are most affected and most concerned about what's happening. We know that if we want to stop nuclear weapons, stop nuclear energy expansion, or the interim waste storage, that we have to first build a base of people, of leaders in these communities who are most affected, to be able to lead the work and to be able to talk about what's happening. At the same time, we really have to educate folks in the communities about what's happening, especially building solidarity between Atlanta and Shell Bluff, Atlanta as this urban area that doesn't see or experience a lot of what's happening. And so one of the ways that Georgia WAND does this is that we have a field organizer on the ground, Bernice, who does a lot of great work in making sure that we can build that community consciousness. So we've been building this base for about 2 years now. We've also really focused on building out an awareness and consciousness around the Pentagon budget and really demystifying how SRS specifically gets its funding and how can we shift that funding to include more environmental monitoring. We've worked with a lot of coalition partners and individuals on ending this kind of environmental violence and structural racism. We're also building on the legacy of Bobby Paul, who is an amazing leader and organizer at Georgia WAND and has done a lot to really lay the groundwork, and expanding Georgia WAND as a committed group of multiracial, multi-generational folks who are all women leading this work. One of the really important parts of environmental monitoring is making sure that people understand how testing is happening. So in order to meet people where they're at and to be truly community-led, we do our programming in Shell Bluff that's based around the needs of the folks as they relate to our work. So this helps provide a more valuable product as well as build trust and develop leadership. So the second thing that we're working on is cleanup and water protection. And the third is a comprehensive emergency response system. One of the ways that we're working on all of these three together is a program that we're launching in 2016 called a Whistle Stop Tour. The Whistle Stop Tour is meant to educate. It's going to travel to various cities starting in Atlanta and down the coast in order to really talk about what our environmental monitoring needs in Shell Bluff so that people know what's in their food and air. We're also developing a partnership with the Savannah River Ecology Lab in which we'll conduct a 3-year environmental monitoring program with oversight from other independent entities. We definitely want to make sure that this program is comprehensive, so we are working to make sure that we can get information from Plant Vogtle so that when we get this environmental monitoring and are able to do community-led testing, that it actually includes all the contaminants. Once we have that accomplished, we are working on cleanup and protection of the water. We know that since the plant was built, there's been very little done to make sure that the water that's going back into the river from SRS is clean. And so the last thing that we really want to work on is comprehensive emergency response systems. So if you can recall that map that I showed a little earlier, you see that Shell Bluff is very close to SRS and to Plant Vogtle, which means that in the event of a nuclear meltdown, folks would need to evacuate rather swiftly. Now, this is a rural community. A lot of folks don't have cars, and so we know that an emergency response system that's going to be effective has to be one that's pre-thought out. A lot of our work around this is making sure that people understand their evacuation routes and making sure that that information is clear so that when drills happen, people understand how they can get out and they don't feel afraid. So then lastly, we have some homework, and that's where y'all come in. So as we work for this environmental monitoring, which is one of our first goals, one of the biggest things that Georgia One needs in order to be successful is to get this story out. Because there's this culture of fear within Shell Bluff, we know that a lot of the storytelling in the media that has to happen has to come from outside the community and has to come in solidarity with the community. So we're encouraging folks to share information about Shell Bluff, Georgia. We're also encouraging folks to follow us on Twitter, to follow us on Facebook. We know that a lot of the social media work that's been done in other communities, specifically in Mexico and other areas where they're dealing with similar issues around nuclear, has only gotten out through the power of social media. As we come into 2016 and develop this whistle stop tour and do education throughout the state, we really rely on these sort of shared narratives in order to build momentum for our asks. For folks who are interested in getting involved, I also really encourage you to join our listserv. You can join by just going to georgiaone.org. And I encourage you to just come by. For folks who are in the Southeast, we would love to talk to you more about plugging in and getting involved with the work regionally, as well as joining our coalition partners that are located in the Southeast. So with that, I'm going to leave it open to questions. This is a lovely picture of some of our staff and board members. And I think taking the time out to listen today.
Thank you so much, Shay. That was a great presentation, very detailed. We do have a few questions, and for those of you who haven't submitted yours, I just want to remind you how to do so. You can type your questions in by typing them into the question panel, and then I'll ask them out loud to Che. So feel free to submit questions, and I'll go ahead and ask the first one. So the first question is from Sean Meyer. Sean asks, what do you know about the potential environmental impacts of the MOX plant being built at Savannah River site?
That is an excellent question. Well, what we do know is MOX will have negative effects. We know that MOX will only increase the levels of tritium that go into the atmosphere. One of the issues that we have outside of MOX is just being able to measure what's in the plumes at all. And so part of the environmental monitoring program is also looking at how do we include more environmental monitoring as MOX is being built.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Tom Ferguson. Tom asks, what impact on and resistance is there in Savannah regarding these issues?
Could you repeat that question, Ezzy?
So Tom is asking, I guess, just about the response to the contamination and all the issues with the Savannah River site in the actual city of Savannah.
Oh, in the city of Savannah.
Yes.
Well, I think that that's one of the issues that we're hoping to address with the Whistle Stop Tour. Outside of Shell Bluff, there isn't a huge consciousness about specifically what's going on with the river. We know that there are what's called Savannah River Keepers and a really great Georgia Water Coalition that does work around the Savannah River. But again, these are professionals, right? These are folks whose job it is to know about water contamination. If we're talking about regular people who live and work near the river, I would say that the understanding is very minimal, and that if anything, the consciousness around contamination is mostly about the paper mills, which, we can talk forever and ever about how much, where contaminants come from, but I think that overwhelmingly part of the Whistle Stop Tour is building in that consciousness and therefore building in the ability to move people around the contaminant of the river that then goes out into the ocean, and that affects an entirely different group of people.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Sarah Barzak. Sarah asks, can you discuss some of the state legislative efforts that Georgia One hopes can happen during the 2016 legislative session?
Absolutely, Sarah. One of the things that we are supporting is SB 36, which is being put out through the Georgia Water Coalition. It is essentially groundwater legislation that will help to increase monitoring, increase our understanding of what's in the water. And so, this is sort of a stepping stone for us. We know that this is the first step in being able to introduce more water legislation that will essentially help us to see the levels of tritium in the water and to create monitoring programs that are not simply temporary, not held within only the Savannah River Ecology Lab.
Great. Well, hopefully we'll see a lot of support for that bill next year. The next question is from Mary Jane Williams, and Mary Jane asks, would it be possible to buy and hand out some sort of radiation monitor to people in Shell Bluff and have them start monitoring themselves? Or do you have any other ideas about citizen-led monitoring possibilities?
That's a great question. So yeah, we have talked a little bit about citizens being able to monitor their property themselves. And there are a lot of tools that cost various amounts that people can purchase and that the organization can purchase to make that happen. One of the issues with that is that in order for us to be able to make policy change and truly to be able to take samples at a level that's high enough to create a true sample, we need equipment that we can't afford, quite frankly. When we toured the Savannah River Ecology Lab and toured the equipment that they use, I think that the device alone that they use just to measure the amount of tritium in the frogs costs something like $200,000, right? Which might be nothing to them, but is a lot of money for a small grassroots organization. And so in thinking about how do we create comprehensive environmental monitoring, part of it is, yes, we want people to feel empowered to be able to start testing their own wells, their own land, and we are looking into how to do that sort of outside of the ecology lab. And the other part of it is that we want to be able to shift policy, and we want to be able to create samples that are vast and that look in the entire 5-mile radius. And so it's sort of a both and kind of question.
All right. The next question. How do you work with other anti-nuclear organizations in other cities as a community-led organization, especially around the issues of racial injustice as part of the environmental issue, which other groups often overlook?
I love that question as a community organizer. I love doing coalition work. I would say that Georgia One does a whole lot of learning from our allies. One of the groups that we've learned a lot from is Gulf South Rising. I really just want to give them credit in terms of the work that we're trying to do around emergency response. We learned a lot from what happened in Katrina about how emergency response systems can fail and how they can actually do more harm than the disaster itself. And so one of the things that we are working with Gulf South Rising and a lot of the folks who have been doing a lot of cleanup from Katrina is understanding how how can we create a comprehensive evacuation system that builds in the needs of a predominantly Black and working class community? How can we have some foresight around the issues that they experience in order to propose them to FEMA? These are things that we would never know on our own. I also really want to uplift the work of the Dene Nation, specifically the young people who are in New Mexico doing work around the Yucca Mountain. We have learned a great deal about the entire process of nuclear production because, you know, Savannah River site are only one part of nuclear waste. The other part is sort of where the reactors go after they're used and how they're disposed of. And so they've really helped us to think holistically about if the end goal is that we want less nuclear production, how do we address that from all levels of the cycle and not just from our level and from our small kind of local lens. And then lastly, there have been a number of plant closures in the country that we've really been following and trying to understand better because this is not an impossible feat, right? And so part of what we've been doing is really studying how other community advisory boards, specifically in the Midwest, have created gateway for plant closures that's holistic, that involves community members, and that really relocates jobs for people so that communities are able to survive and thrive even after these plants close.
Yeah, that's an excellent point about minimizing job loss. The next question is from Tamara Johnson-Sheely, and Tamara says, I'm a native of Savannah and most of my family lives in Effingham County. What kind of community engagement opportunities can I share with them?
Well, they can join us on our Whistle Stop tour in 2016. Truly, I would love to talk more offline about how your family can get involved with the tour and maybe come to one of the stops. One of the things that we really encourage folks is to tell the story. Another thing that we encourage folks to do is to get plugged in. I can definitely send you some information on the next time that we're going to be in the Savannah River area, Savannah area specifically. And then lastly, we attend community advisory board meetings that the Savannah River site has, I think, every other month. And I know that a couple of those meetings are coming up in Savannah. And so, you know, one of the things that we really encourage folks to do is to turn out to those meetings and to send in public comments, because it's important that they hear from community and that they understand that that the community cares about what's happening near them, and specifically in the Savannah River.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Amy Matthews. Amy asks, do you have connections with the environmental justice programs of the Sierra Club?
The short answer is yes, we do. We are coalition partners, as well as I believe we're on a couple of working groups that came out of the Sierra Club.
Oh, great.
I'm not sure. There might have been more to that question, but that's the short answer.
I think that was simple enough. Next question. You mentioned the federal connection as far as Pentagon spending and nuclear weapons and nuclear power. So for those of us who don't live in Georgia, is there any advocacy we can do around the federal budget and federal priorities that will help with these issues?
Oh, whose question was that?
Anonymous asker.
Got it. Yes, there is a lot that we can do at the federal level. Thank you for asking. So one of the things that Georgia WAND is looking at now is how the Savannah River site gets its budget through Congress. We know that, you know, we've met with the director of Savannah River site, Jack Craig. We've met with the director of Savannah River Ecology Lab, and they, just as much as us, would like to get their budget sooner, and they would like for a budget that is comprehensive. We would like for them to have a budget that includes more environmental monitoring. All of that is controlled by Congress. And so one of the things that we are looking at in probably the next session, we have a little bit of research to do, is figuring out how to put pressure on Congress to be able to create a budget within SRS that will also fulfill the needs of the community. And what's great about that is that SRS is in great communication with us, and they are definitely in support of us figuring out how to make that budget accessible and understandable to community members. So that's one of the things that we're doing at the federal level. There's definitely a lot of other avenues that we've thought about in terms of Plant Vogtle energy site that are still in the works. I can't talk too much about them yet, but I think that at the end of the day, most of our work around federal spending is first demystifying how things get funded to regular people, because it's confusing and can be overwhelming for folks who are really trying to push on change.
Well, wonderful, Che. Your presentation was so thorough that we are out of questions. So I just want to say thank you to everyone on the line, and thank you to Che especially for your really great presentation. I think very detailed and digestible and illuminating. So thank you very much. And to everyone who joined us on the line, please be sure to fill out the feedback survey, which will appear on your screen when the webinar ends. And we'll also be sending you follow-up materials by email, which will include the link to this webinar recording. So thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And thank you especially, Che.